Welcome to the October 2020 meeting of the Regional Transportation Advisory Council. And we have a nice agenda for today, but not a packed agenda. So we may end the meeting early, and there's no problem with that. So I'll just turn it over to Matt, Mr. Archer now to give us the guidelines for the meeting.
Thank you very much, Len. Hey, everyone. Everybody, as you may have noticed, when you join the meeting, your microphone is muted. If you could rename yourself with your first and last name, that would be great. Just makes it easier to call on folks. For this meeting, we are allowing people to mute and unmute themselves, but please be respectful about it. The mute button is located at the bottom left of your screen, and folks who are calling in can dial *6 to mute and unmute. To participate in the discussion during questions and answers, please use the raise hand function. You can find this by clicking on the participants button at the bottom of the screen, and a window will pop up with a raise hand button at the bottom. The presenters will then call on participants to unmute their microphones. If you are on the phone, you can use *9 to raise your hand. And if you're having any technical difficulties, please contact me via the chat box, marcher@ctps.org, or at 857-702-3708. Len, back to you.
I was having problems unmuting myself. Anyway, so I was going to say, yeah, please do use the raise hand function, because you're all gorgeous people, but I usually just have like one little square open, and so I'm not able to see the whole gallery view. And so I am really relying on the raise hand function next to the names in order to see who wants to talk. And before we dive into the agenda, though, there's one thing that isn't on here that I wanted to bring up, and that is that the meeting that's scheduled for next month was going to be on the 11th, which is a holiday meeting. So we are going to have it on the 4th. Okay, and so it'll be November 4th. So just want to point that out, and we'll be sending out the agenda, of course, about a week in advance. So with that, I'm going to move to the first element on the agenda, which is the final meeting in the process of TIP criteria, selection criteria development. And so the MPO has approved these, but we still have the ability to make some input if we want. And so with that, I'm going to turn it over to Matt. And we've allotted an hour. We may take that amount of time, we may take less. And so with that, Matt, thanks for joining us. Matt, if you're talking, I'm not hearing you.
Oh, sorry. Just got on mute. Can you guys hear me now?
Yeah.
Okay, perfect. Thanks, Len, and hello, everyone. It's good to be back at RTAC for the first time in a while, so thanks for having me. So today I'll present a summary of the content from the last handful of MPO meetings, during which time the MPO board voted, as Len mentioned, to endorse the new TIP criteria. There's a lot to cover in this presentation, so I'm going to move through things a little bit quickly. It's going to be kind of dense, but we'll have about half the time for question and answers and to talk through things. So yeah, please don't hesitate to ask questions. So here's the ground that I'll cover during today's presentation. I'll start by reminding you all of what our previous TIP scoring framework looked like before diving into the new framework endorsed by the MPO. I'll then discuss the results of the test scoring that we conducted using the new criteria, talk a little bit about some of the recent public outreach we did on the proposed criteria, and then highlight some of the key takeaways from this process as a whole. At the end, I'll briefly highlight some next steps and future opportunities for project scoring before we have a conversation again with the time that is remaining. So I want to take a few minutes to remind you all of how our current scoring, or our previous scoring system worked. So as you all have seen over our many conversations on the tip, our previous scoring system was on an overall scale of 134 points. Those points were broken down across these 6 goal areas outlined in the long-range plan, as you see here: safety, system preservation, etc. So these breakdowns make a little bit more sense when translated into percentages. Our highest scoring goal area is safety, followed very closely by system preservation and capacity management and mobility, all 3 of which in the previous scoring system were at roughly 22% of total possible points. From there, the other 3 goal areas were clustered between 9 and 13% of possible points, with equity occupying the 6th and lowest spot. We've talked quite a bit over the last several months about some of the elements of the current or of the previous scoring system that we are aiming to improve upon, transitioning from a 134-point system to something a little bit more legible was certainly one goal, as was raising the relative emphasis on equity, which is something that my colleague Betsy Harvey has discussed with you all at previous meetings. So when we break our previous scoring scale out by project type, you can see here that the same weight is placed on each goal area across all investment programs. One of the themes that we came back to several times throughout the criteria revision process was that our current criteria, though uniform across investment programs, didn't apply equally to all projects. For example, bicycle and pedestrian projects tended not to improve transit assets, and intersection improvement projects tend not to rehabilitate many bridges. This led many projects to receive scores of 0 in criteria that didn't meaningfully apply to them. Additionally, we've yet to score any transit modernization projects. And so one of the key goals of this process was to really define the criteria for that investment program as well. So I'll dive now into the new scoring framework. This discussion will cover the overall scoring system as well as the point allocations across investment programs and goal areas. I'll also run through a scoring example to show you how everything will work before diving into the test scoring that we conducted. So as MPO staff for crafting the proposal for the new criteria, the general approach taken was to try to accomplish 4 main things. First, staff incorporated feedback received from both the MPO, members of the public, and members of RTAC. Second, staff endeavored to make the final overall score one that is easier to understand than the 134-point system that we just discussed. Third, staff aimed to increase the overall weight of equity and highlight these points in the overall scoring system. And finally, staff opted to apply scoring criteria to major infrastructure projects, depending on the type of project in question. And on that last point, even though we have a separate funding category for major infrastructure projects, these projects themselves are still largely just corridor, intersection, or transit projects. For that reason, and based on MPO feedback, we elected to propose a system that would apply the best fit criteria from the complete streets, intersection improvements, and transit modernization programs to major infrastructure projects, dependent upon the major infrastructure projects in question. For instance, if a project like Rutherford Avenue, which we've talked about before, comes to the MPO, this project is essentially just a very large complete streets project. Its price tag of $140 million lands it in the MPO's major infrastructure program, but it would still be scored using the complete streets criteria, as the essential elements of this project, things like bicycle and pedestrian accommodations and improvements to transit infrastructure, are the same. As a quick aside, there has been a series of very active discussions at the MPO over the last few months on how we should define and program major infrastructure projects. I know my colleague Anne McGann came and talked to you all last month about that, and those conversations may still continue in the coming weeks at the MPO, so there may be more on that in the near future. So I'll start outlining our new scoring system a little bit. The new scoring system is on a 100-point scale, with the integrated equity approach accounting for 20 points or 20% of the total score. The remaining 5 goal areas comprise the other 80 points, and this basic 80-20 breakdown in points remains consistent across all 5 investment programs, as you see here. So I'll walk through what things look like when we distribute those 80 points across the other 5 goal areas. You'll notice that unlike our current system, or unlike our previous system rather, the points distributed to each goal area vary across investment programs. This is most notable in the transit modernization program, in which system preservation and capacity management are rated significantly more heavily than safety, the points for which are shown on the screen right now. This is because we're likely to fund many projects that emphasize these areas, like transit station enhancements or new vehicle purchases, rather than projects that would have a meaningful impact on transit safety. So as we start to layer on the rest of the points, you'll also notice other variations, like how there are fewer system preservation points for bicycle and pedestrian projects than there are for roadway projects. This is because many of the projects we see through this program are creating new facilities, like rail trails, rather than reconstructing existing biking and walking paths. These themes are present throughout, as the point values for the goal areas within each investment program are tailored to the projects that we aim to fund through each. Here are the capacity management and mobility points, followed by the clean air and sustainable communities points, and then economic vitality. And finally, our 20 points for equity, which again is consistent across all project types. So here you can see how the new scoring system compares side by side with the previous system, which is displayed here on the right-hand side of the screen, with each goal area as a percentage of total points. Again, the main changes here are to more heavily emphasize equity, while also drawing distinctions between the relative weights of the other goal areas across project types. So to show how this new system plays out, I'll run through an example scoring scenario for a fictitious intersection improvement project. To begin, you can see that intersection projects can score up to the listed point values in each goal area, summing to a total of 80 base points. Because of the multiplier approach that we're using for the equity scoring, the possible points for equity don't neatly add up to the 100-point scale that we're aiming for. This is a solvable problem, however, as the equity score can be scaled using a simple ratio in order to make the total equity score out of our desired 20 points. This puts us on track to have the final total score for each project out of 100 possible points. I'll walk you through the scaling process here in just a few slides. For now, let's say that our intersection improvement projects score the points shown here in each of the base criteria, 14 points out of 21 in safety, 12 out of 17 in system preservation, etc. These points, those points add up to a base score of 48 points out of 80, not bad. As you see here, however, our equity multiplier across all of the applicable base criteria has resulted in an unscaled equity score of 22 points out of a possible unscaled total of 38. To arrive at our final score, nothing changes in the base scoring as these point values already line up with our desired total of 80 base points. To bring our overall equity score in line with the other goal areas, we'll need to do some quick math to scale the raw score down to 20 points. Here we would take our unscaled equity point value, divide it by the unscaled possible equity points, and then multiply it by our desired equity total. So using our example from before, we would take the unscaled equity score of 22 points, divide it by the total possible unscaled equity points for intersection projects, which is 38, and then multiply it by our desired scaled total of 20. This results in an equity score of 11.6 points. So if we go back to our scoring example, again, we have a base score of 48 points, and then we bring in our scaled equity score of 11.6. When we add these two numbers together, we arrive at our final overall score on our 100-point system of 59.6 points. Again, there's a little bit of math here, but nothing that's too cumbersome as a component of the overall scoring process. So what are some of the benefits of this new system? As noted earlier, this proposal results in a more legible and intuitive scoring system, where point values can be easily translated into a percentage of total points. The new system also clearly weights equity more highly, a theme that again has emerged in staff conversations with this body, the MPO board, and with the public. When combined with the changes in methodology that my colleague Betsy Harvey has proposed, and which she walked you through in prior meetings, We think this system will result in a more accurate measurement of the benefits of projects for equity populations, while better recognizing those benefits in a project's overall score. The proposal also retains the relative importance of safety and system preservation, which is a key theme that emerged in past discussions with the MPO. And finally, by reducing the overall number of points, the proposed scoring system necessitates a more focused set of criteria, as there are fewer points to distribute broadly to a range of items within any given criterion. On the flip side, reducing the overall number of points doesn't allow for quite the same level of gradation within each criterion. For example, the scale for reducing carbon dioxide emissions is currently out of 5 points and is scaled with relatively small increments of emissions reductions to match that. The new emission scale is now out of 3 points, with the increments for any given point level broadened. While on the one hand, this allows for slightly less differentiation in project scores within each criterion. On the other hand, this proposed system reduces the impact of uncertainties in the project evaluation process. So early on in the criteria revision process, we heard some feedback from the MPO that having narrow scoring bands for any given criterion communicates a level of precision in the measurement of something like air quality impacts, when in reality, these things are hard to measure precisely at the early design stage in which we see most projects. Reducing the overall number of scoring bands and broadening their ranges will help reduce this dynamic going forward. And finally, as noted in the previous slide, the system requires an extra calculation to arrive at a final equity score. While not overly complex, this does add a new element that wasn't in our previous system, meaning that staff need to communicate this clearly to project proponents and to the public so that the scoring process remains transparent. So unlike earlier, when I walked through how the new scoring framework would function using a fictitious intersection improvement project, now we're going to use real tip projects to demonstrate how scores calculated using the current system would look, translated into the new scale and using the new criteria. So here's the general approach that staff took when conducting test scoring for the new criteria. First, we selected a handful of representative projects from the Complete Streets, Intersection Improvements, and Bicycle Network and Pedestrian Connections investment programs. We endeavored to select projects that feature a range of elements and baseline scores to try to understand how different aspects of the new criteria play out. We then conducted the test scoring. I do want to note that 3 criteria worth a total of 5 points were not evaluated during test scoring, as this project information wasn't readily available. This is information that we would ordinarily gather during the normal project evaluation process from project proponents and other sources, but given the time-sensitive nature of the test scoring process, that data gathering process was a little bit constrained. I also do want to note that though we use currently programmed tip projects to conduct test scoring, these projects will be anonymized as we talk through the results. This was done to allay any potential fears among project proponents that their projects were being rescored, as well as to keep today's conversation focused more on how the criteria function as a whole, rather than the specifics of any given project. So beginning now with the test scoring results for bicycle and pedestrian projects, staff scored 2 rail trails with different project elements to try to understand how the new criteria play out. You can see here that the 2 projects had original scores of 53 and 47 points, so they fared somewhat similarly using our previous criteria. Here's how the 2 projects fared in test scoring. You can see that some of the original disparities in safety were eliminated, as project number 1 was no longer awarded points for having high crash rates and EPDO in the project area. By eliminating these criteria for bicycle and pedestrian projects, we focus more directly on the safety issues and improvements actually being addressed by the project itself, rather than nearby problem areas that may be completely unrelated to the project. In other scoring areas, the system preservation points stayed relatively similar in test scoring when compared to the original scores. In capacity management, you can see that both projects got full points, as they're both creating high quality separated facilities that create new connections and close gaps in the bicycle and pedestrian network. In clean air and sustainable communities, project number 1 saw an increase in relative score because it's now receiving bonus points for reducing nitrogen oxide emissions in an area with existing high concentrations of this pollutant, which is a new criterion in the revised scoring system. And finally, in economic vitality, project number 1 lost some points because we're no longer awarding points for towns having smart growth zoning or business improvement districts, while project number 2 gained an extra point for having a dedicated community outreach process in support of this project prior to seeking funding in the TIP. Finally, on equity, you can see that project number 2 saw a relative increase in its equity score. This is because we're no longer using cutoffs for equity scoring, below which a project would previously have received 0 points. In this case, the project has equity populations in the project area that weren't being recognized in the previous scoring system, but that are more fully recognized here using our new equity index. So some of the takeaways from the bicycle and pedestrian project test scores. First, the scoring revealed that we are reducing some of the points that we previously awarded to projects for elements that were only tangentially related to the project itself, things like crashes on parallel roadways and nearby business improvement districts. There's also the potential to explore adjusting how we approach capacity management scoring to draw more distinctions between projects. This will be handled as we continue to build out the final scoring methodologies in the coming weeks. And finally, the equity scoring here is clearly recognizing more people in the project area that went previously unrecognized, which is a significant benefit of the new scoring approach. Moving now to the test scoring results for complete streets projects. We test scored 3 projects for which the baseline scores are shown here. We chose projects with a range of scores from 43 up to 83 points. It included a project number 1, that saw a negative score in clean air and sustainable communities. We also included a project with a baseline equity score of 0, which is project number 3. So here's how test scoring played out for these 3 projects. Beginning with safety, you can see that the distribution of scores across projects remains comparable here from baseline to test scoring, with lower point values across the board on the new lower scale. In system preservation, things remain relatively similar to the baseline scoring as well, though project number 1 did see a slight increase due to methodology changes in how we measure improvements to pavement condition. In capacity management, there also aren't any changes to the relative performance of projects. In clean air and sustainable communities, however, we do see a further decrease in the already negative score of project number 1. This is because the project increases emissions on a corridor with already high localized NOx pollution. This change reflects the feedback that we heard from you all and from others that penalties should be stiffer for those projects that work against our regional emissions goals, especially in areas with high concentrations of existing pollutants. In economic vitality, scores also stay comparable to each project's baseline, though in equity, you can see that there were significant shifts in scores. Here, both projects number 1 and number 3 had an equity multiplier of 1.5, while project number 2 reached the maximum equity multiplier of 2 based on the high concentrations of equity populations in the project area. You can see that project number 1 retained its relatively low equity score, and project number 2 retained its relatively high equity score. For project number 3, in the previous scoring system, this project would have had a fair number of people who qualify as equity populations, but these numbers would have been slightly below the regional average, resulting in a baseline equity score of 0. Under the new system, these populations are more fully recognized, resulting in a significant increase in the project's overall equity score. That being said, the final overall scores for all 3 projects remain comparable to their relative baseline scores, just like with the previously discussed bicycle and pedestrian projects. Again, for some overall takeaways, negative scores in criteria like emissions can become more pronounced given the effect of the equity multiplier on these criteria. Furthermore, a plurality of projects will have an equity multiplier of 1.5 because of the standard deviation methodology my colleague Betsy Harvey used to set the scale. This means that only projects that are more than half of a standard deviation from the mean in terms of the concentration of equity populations in the project area will receive a multiplier of 1.25 or lower, or 1.75 or higher. Finally, we also test scored some intersection improvement projects. You can see the baseline scores here, the distribution of overall scores between 31 and 51 points. Sorry. Here we go. Again, we add in the test scores here, noting the overall new scores remain relatively comparable across projects. In safety, the scores again stay relatively similar, though in system preservation, project number 3's score drops relatively further due to a change in how we measure the replacement of existing traffic signals. The same dynamic plays out in capacity management, where projects number 2 and 3 see a point reduction due to a decrease in points for reducing auto congestion in the new criteria. In clean air and sustainable communities, project number 1 benefited from an additional point for increasing access to open space, while projects number 2 and 3 benefited from the bonus points for reducing NOx emissions in polluted areas. Second. Sorry, too much talking here. In economic vitality, project number 2 lost some points because we no longer give projects points for being in a town with smart growth zoning or a business improvement district. And for equity scoring, all 3 projects remain comparable to their original scores. And again, all 3 projects had the same equity multiplier of 1.5. So in addition to what's been highlighted in previous slides, another key takeaway here is that the new criteria reward fewer points to improvements that are solely focused on cars, like the replacement of existing traffic signals and intersection delay reductions. This is intentional, as we've heard from this body, as well as from the MPO and the public, that all of our projects should be multimodal in focus. And so we certainly want our new scoring system to reflect those values and goals, which were established in the long-range plan. So there were several key takeaways that emerged from our test scoring exercise. Overall, we saw that scores didn't vary greatly from the previous criteria to the new criteria relative to peer projects within the same goal area. There were some adjustments in points based on criteria that were added or removed. But the overall system isn't a wholesale change in how projects score or how they rank relative to each other. In our previous scoring system, projects that accomplish a lot tend to score well, and that's certainly no different in the new scoring system. Second, we saw that our revised approach to equity scoring is more fully recognizing all people within a project area, meaning that we're accomplishing the goals that we set for ourselves on this front. Third, if anything, the scores that were presented here are slightly lower than they otherwise would be, as a handful of criteria were unscored due to data limitations. As we bring projects into the scoring pipeline for the coming TIP cycle, we'll ensure that we gather this additional data from project proponents so that these criteria can be scored fully. And finally, we reduce point values for criteria that focus solely on auto improvements and reduce some of the existing redundancy in this area. We also eliminated points allotted to criteria that scored elements only tangentially associated with the project in question, including points for business improvement districts and points for crashes on roadways that are unrelated to the project. On the flip side, we also saw increases in points for investments in resiliency and for improving air quality in parts of the region with high concentrations of pollutants. So while we were conducting test scoring, we were also doing a second round of outreach on the changes to the TIP criteria. I'll give a quick shout out to Kate White and Betsy Harvey on MPO staff for all their hard work facilitating this outreach. So we conducted an online survey that received 514 responses, including responses across different languages. The survey questions focused on the extent to which folks approved of the changes that we proposed to the criteria. To help people take the survey and understand the changes that we proposed to the criteria, we created a short guidebook that put in plain language many of the key changes and included background information on the criteria broadly, as well as links to resources for folks to learn more. Overall, there was a high level of support for all of the proposed changes, with anywhere between 70 and 90+% of survey takers fully or somewhat supporting each change. Throughout the TIP criteria revision process, we reached more than 1,000 people through both surveys and focus groups, which helped us increase awareness of the MPO in the region and strengthen relationships with many of our partner organizations. Also highlight that this most recent round of outreach connected with a much more diverse audience than the MPO typically reaches, including greater levels of diversity in race, income levels, geography, and languages spoken. Going forward, we hope to continue to build upon the partnerships that supported this work so that we can ensure that we continue to bring new and different voices into the mix in a more consistent way. So now that we've covered the work staff did to arrive at a final draft of the new criteria, I want to take a few minutes to recap the goals that we outlined for this project back in the fall of 2019 to assess how far we've come with the project as a whole. So when we first began this process, we set 5 goals for this project overall, including creating criteria for the transit modernization program, creating better measures of specific elements associated with different project types, creating criteria that better align with the goals of each investment program, eliminating some of the scoring disparities across different types of projects, and finally allowing for the best projects in each category to achieve something much closer to full points. In terms of accomplishing these goals, everything was either fully or partially accomplished. We created criteria to evaluate transit modernization projects and certainly eliminated many of the criteria that projects didn't meaningfully score on, which means the criteria are now much more closely aligned with the types of projects that we see in each category. Some disparities still remained across project types in test scoring, with intersection projects scoring slightly lower on average than complete streets projects. Bicycle and pedestrian projects, however, did see relatively higher scores compared to their baseline. That being said, this is likely at least partially a function of the limited sample of projects that was test scored and the specific elements of those projects. So some of those disparities may evaporate even further as more projects are scored using the new criteria. Finally, no project received a perfect score in test scoring, but upon further reflection, the framing of this original goal may have been a bit ambitious. The reality is that no project will likely ever see a perfect score, as we don't expect any one project to do everything. That being said, under the original criteria, the highest scoring projects were getting 55 to 60% of total points. In the new system, those same projects are getting roughly 70% of total points. Again, that reinforces the idea that we've eliminated some of the criteria that projects weren't meaningfully achieving. So when this project began, MPO staff also outlined 5 central principles to guide this work. Those included that the resulting criteria be manageable to implement, make use of the best available data and methods, create balance across investment programs, be both realistic and aspirational, and be clear to project proponents and other stakeholders. As you can see here, we had varying levels of success in adhering to these principles. In terms of implementation, the new criteria are slightly more complex than where we started, though that complexity allowed us to achieve many of the goals listed on the last slide. Because of this, we'll give us partial credit on this goal, though the criteria are still very much implementable. We are taking into account new data where possible, such as disparities in exposure to air pollution and goals outlined in municipalities' vulnerability plans. There are certainly still opportunities for growth on this front, however, as I'll come back to in just a minute. As I noted on the last slide, scores are more balanced than where we started, although there may still be some discrepancies across investment programs. Again, we'll have a better sense of how this plays out as we test score much larger samples of projects in the coming TIP cycles. On being both realistic and aspirational, we are asking projects to do several new things with respect to resiliency, transit, public engagement, and other areas, which makes the criteria more aspirational than our starting point. We've also retained many of the basic criteria that plenty of projects reliably accomplish to some degree, and so in this sense, the criteria are still very much realistic for project proponents to achieve. Finally, I give us a mark of fully adhering to the final criteria being clear, as MPO staff are working to roll out a slate of explanatory materials to ensure project proponents and the public fully understand the new scoring system. I'll talk a little bit more about these materials in just a second. So though we've made significant updates to the criteria through this effort, there are certainly still opportunities for further improvements in the future. First, there's an opportunity to move some of our criteria from proximity-based metrics, like whether or not a project is near an area targeted for future economic growth, to access-based metrics. This would allow for a measure of the extent to which improvements made by a given project, like adding bike or bus lanes, actually increase the access of residents of the region to jobs and services. MPO staff are working with MassDOT staff to explore the use of Conveil or a similar software to conduct these analyses. We'll continue to keep you all updated as this project develops. Second, there are also opportunities to use a similar analytical approach to measure safety, which would allow for a measure of predicted reductions in crashes based on specific improvements being made by a project. MPO staff are in the early stages of exploring this and will keep you all informed as this effort moves forward as well. Third, because the Transit Modernization Program is still in its infancy and no projects have yet been scored for funding through this program, staff will continue to monitor the types of projects that seek funding and continually evaluate these criteria to assess whether further changes are warranted. And finally, staff intend to follow up with the MPO in the coming months to continue the conversation from last winter around cost effectiveness measures and any policy changes the board may want to consider when projects see significant increases in cost after being programmed. Though any policy changes here wouldn't be a part of the criteria proper, they're still very much related to the broader project selection process. And so we intend to have a follow-up conversation on this subject before we get too far into the coming tip cycle. Finally, as I mentioned, staff are working to create a suite of supporting materials to help communicate the new criteria and facilitate project selection. First, we plan to update the criteria guidebook that I mentioned earlier to include the final criteria changes. This will act as a nice, plain language summary of the process as a whole. Staff will also update the detailed scoring methodologies for all of the criteria, outlining the scoring by investment program. Updates will also be made to the TIP project proponent questionnaire, which is the principal way MPO staff gather scoring information for each prospective TIP project. Focus questionnaires will be made for each project type. And finally, staff will explore bringing back the TIP how-to guide. This guide was last made in 2010 or 2011 and was a one-stop shop for understanding the TIP process. Given the changes to the investment programs and some of the complexities introduced by the new criteria, this is an ideal time to consider bringing this resource back in an updated form. So I realize that was a ton of information, so I'm more than happy to take questions or comments with any remaining time. So I'll leave it all up to you to guide the conversation from here, but thanks as always for your time on this.
Thanks, Matt. Sometimes I wish I could run your presentations like through a DVR and then just kind of stop and go back, catch things, and then come back up. It's not only you, it's also me, and that's a compliment. It's just deliciously complex, and that goes for a lot of the presentations to the MPO and us. So, and that's also to say, folks, it is a lot, and we may need to revisit this on our own in subsequent meetings, because these are recorded so we can look at them, and so don't feel as if this is your only shot to make comments. We will address this as much as members feel that they want to. So with that, raise hands, please. Use the raise hand function so I can call on you as your hands go up. And Matt, for those on phone, how can I do it?
Yes, so if you are calling in on the phone, you can press *9 to raise your hand. And just as a quick reminder for other folks, the raise hand button can be found by clicking on the participants menu at the bottom of your screen, or the participants button, excuse me, and then clicking on the raise hand button.
Great. Okay, Andy, you're up and you can unmute yourself. Oh, maybe
See, can you all hear me now?
Yeah.
Okay, great. So I actually had a few questions just to clarify. So I think it's pretty cool that you all are taking a look at this in a way that seems to respond to a lot of the principles that I think you've probably heard from folks on the RTAC and I'm sure through many other kind of venues. So glad to see actually you all did some kind of test run, and I was actually curious about some of these test runs. I'm just kind of interested in that they produced some results that I didn't expect. So one of which was with the Complete Streets projects that you ran the test scores to. I thought it was interesting that there was the clean air negative score that remained even more negative, but also that the safety score went down. And given that Complete Streets projects tend to be safety-oriented for bicycle and pedestrian for street users, right? The vulnerable street users. I was wondering if there's some aspect to this kind of scoring that may be deprioritizing one of the main reasons why municipalities may pursue these kind of complete streets projects, which is usually a focus on pedestrian and cyclist safety, and whether kind of this balancing has done something that kind of, you know, maybe pulls away from that initial desire for the original like project as well too. So that was one question, and then kind of related to that, because I am a transit planner. I know that sometimes when we do complete streets projects, we pursue things that may delay vehicles and may technically add to congestion, but it is in the service of mode shift. And you know, I'm not sure if maybe the clean air analysis gets at that or not, but wondering how this kind of desire to push people into choosing the sustainable modes that are already there are included in kind of a complete streets project analysis.
Totally. So yeah, lots of good questions. I'll try to sort of take them in pieces here. I guess starting with the lower safety scores. So this is largely a function of, and sorry, there's actually a typo under project number 1. This new score safety should actually be out of 20 points, not out of 18. But the reductions in points there is largely a function of actually just reducing the overall number of points that the safety goal is out of. And that's really, again, sort of a function of the larger effort to transition the overall scoring scale from 134 points down to 100 points. And so sort of by nature, all the scores got a little bit more compressed, which is sort of part of what's going on here. And then again, so we did shift overall some points away from other goal area, really from all the goal areas into equity, to more than double the consideration of that, just because, you know, we got a lot of feedback that having only 9% of points allocated to equity, which is what it was under the previous scoring system, was just too low. And so, you know, sort of by nature, we had to, you know, pull a handful of points out of each of these other goal areas in order to strike a better balance there. So that's largely what's contributing to the lowering of the safety scores here. And then on your question about clean air. So project number 1 got a -1 in its original scoring in clean air because it increased emissions. And based on some feedback from this board, as well as from the MPO and the public, you know, there was a desire to say, like, if a project is increasing emissions, we actually want that to be penalized further. And then we also got a lot of feedback, you know, especially during, you know, the current pandemic, about the intersection between, you know, health and areas of high concentrations of pollutants today, and sort of the need to not only to both make those things better, but also sort of avoid making them worse. And so in this case, this project was penalized further because it increased emissions in an area with already high levels of emissions. And so it's sort of making a bad problem worse, which we heard, again, sort of a lot of feedback saying, like, if you're making a bad problem worse, you should be losing some points. And that's sort of what's happening here. Let's see, and then your other question on congestion and transit improvements. So we largely moved, so in the previous scoring system, we have the, you know, air quality scoring, which is partially based on congestion, things like signal delay. But then we also had a separate criterion in the capacity management area for reducing auto delay, sort of a standalone thing. Basically, we've done away with the reducing auto delay standalone criterion entirely, and transition that to sort of a lower weighted criterion around reliability. And so really, basically, sort of, it's a yes or no question right now. Like, is, you know, a given corridor or intersection unreliable beyond a certain threshold? Meaning, like, does it have a lot of variation in travel times along the corridor? And so, you know, if you're addressing, basically, if you're, you know, right now the situation is like, if you're making multimodal improvements on an unreliable corridor, then you would get that point. But we're not explicitly rewarding points strictly for reducing auto congestion anymore, just because, again, we heard from this body as well as from the board that, you know, reducing auto congestion as a standalone goal is really not something we should be focusing on, because that leads to largely, working against most of our other goal areas, especially safety, and especially sort of multimodal improvements in capacity management. If we're taking more space for, moving cars faster, then that tends to limit our options for things like, wider sidewalks, bike lanes, bus lanes, all those sorts of things. And so we did increase the relative weighting of improvements for transit supportive infrastructure, specifically projects that reduce transit delay. So if you're implementing transit signal priority, adding a dedicated bus lane, like those sorts of things, you would score relatively more points now than you would have scored in the prior system. So there's a lot going on there. We shifted around a number of points, but the upshot is that we did try to strike a better balance between improvements to transit and improvements that strictly benefit auto congestion. And again, in the previous scoring system, we were sort of double counting auto congestion improvements in both air quality and in capacity management. And we've sort of basically just done away with that double counting, and just are counting those improvements once in air quality. There's a lot there, and feel free to let me know if I need to clarify any of that.
All right, you're set, Andy?
I did have actually one more question for clarification then. So for the bike ped piece as well too, I think you said some rail trails. You removed an element that focused on high crash locations on maybe parallel or unrelated corridors. I think from a bike planning perspective, a lot of the times those rail trail corridors in particular are the off-street option from getting away from those high crash locations as a comfortable place to bike. So I feel a little conflicted about whether that's maybe made up for in another part of the scoring, but just thinking about it from a network perspective, definitely an off-street connection is going to be a very highly comfortable, low-stress location for people to bike. And if we are getting folks off of those streets where there are a lot of crashes and are not very comfortable to bike in, there's a benefit there that I think a lot of these projects are trying to get at. But I'm not sure if it's worth to be scored, to be honest. So just kind of, trying to be aware that these projects are being pursued probably out of a sense of trying to get high comfort facilities more than anything else, and making sure that that kind of principle is at the core of it. So yeah, I think those are my two questions. So thank you.
Well, it's interesting you bring that up, because I had noticed that too. And so I was wondering what was defined as outside of the project, because I could see maybe a street or two next to the trail being counted as part of the project, and maybe if you were a mile or so away, it was not counted as part of the project. So maybe Matt can discuss that a little more.
Yeah, definitely. And sort of in full transparency here, this is definitely something that at the staff level and at the board as well, we sort of went back and forth on, and it is a thorny issue, and you're right that it does feel a little bit conflicting to be no longer counting places with like a high EPDO, for instance. And so basically the sort of compromise that we tried to strike here was that if there are crash clusters in an area where a bicycle or pedestrian improvement is being made, bike ped projects can still score some extra points for those things. So that would still identify places where, there are like a significant number of crashes. The issue with what we were running into with both sort of crash rate and EPDO is that for a lot of bike ped facilities, there just wasn't a clear and consistent way to measure it. And so, I get some of the things we were thinking about as staff is like, well, for some facilities, there's a clear parallel route that you could say like, okay, if we're adding this facility, clearly people are using this major corridor, parallel to the new facility. And so a lot of people would probably transfer from that major corridor onto this new rail trail or what have you. So for those projects, it might have made sense to retain that measure. But for a lot of projects, there isn't a clear parallel route. And so it would be sort of guesswork to say like, what route do we think people are using today? Where are they trying to go to and from? And for a lot of especially more, like suburban locations with rail trails? The answer is that a lot of those trips just aren't being made today. Like people aren't using those parallel routes to bike because, they don't feel safe. And so, so we're really not correcting for sort of existing like bicycle crashes on a parallel route because people aren't really biking there. And in a lot of cases, like we just lacked good data on bicycle and pedestrian crashes to really say like, okay, we can sort of take we'll contribute to reducing crashes in one place by making a facility in another place. So basically things just got very murky once we started to really think about like all the specifics of the methodology for scoring things like crash rates with an off-street bike ped facility. And so where we sort of landed was instead of really focusing on trying to wade through all of that, let's really keep the focus on what facilities are being created and is, sort of presume that there is a pretty big safety benefit. So really right now it's like, if you're creating a high quality off-street biker ped facility, you're going to score pretty highly in safety because we recognize that that's a safe facility. And so that's really like the, where we landed. And then, if that facility intersects roadways where there are, crash clusters or things like that, you would still score points for that. And then furthermore, at those intersections, if the project is doing things to calm traffic and those sorts of things, then you would also score points for making those improvements. So we basically just tried to shift the balance of points for bike ped projects to really like, what is the project doing to promote bike ped safety when, measuring the sort of current issues is very murky. One of the things we saw was really going back through the specific scores of like lots of past projects in this is that, projects were getting points for, frankly, like a project near an interstate was like, there were crashes on an interstate that was sort of within the bubble buffer of a bike ped project. And like those crashes were getting picked up in our analysis. And so it's like, but the bike ped facility has nothing to do with the interstate. It just happens to be adjacent to it. And, it's like those sorts of things were really like creating a situation where the score wasn't actually reflective of what the project was doing. And so we, wanted to move away from that. So that's where we landed. That's a lot of detail, but yeah.
That was very helpful. That was very insightful. No, I'm serious. I mean, I really appreciate that. And I think I'll go ahead and speak for Andy and say he does too. I'm glad that question was asked. And so next up is John.
Hi, can you hear me?
We sure can. We can hear
you. Anyway, Matt, this really has made an improvement, I think, especially you can see it in the equity lines and where it really rebalances and is much more context sensitive. I guess I'm still a little murky on really murky, on what some of the specific facilities would be in some of the project areas, let's say project 1 and project 2, or just as an example, going across clean air and or economic vitality. What really was going on that pushed the levers for any of those, actually for project 3 as well? I mean, were there some specific, let's say hot button types of facilities that drove a bigger score or a bigger decline?
Yeah, so a lot of the difference there is we'll start with economic vitality. So a lot of the differences here is really like where the project is located. So project number 2 is in like a dense like town center sort of location. And so, it's an area where there are high concentrations of like jobs and services today. There's also projected like future growth on those fronts. Whereas like project number 3, for instance, is a more like for like a further flung suburban location where like there aren't a lot of jobs and services today. It's also not in an area that's a priority location for future growth of jobs and services. And so, for economic vitality, that's where a lot of the differences are coming in. is really, it's about like, where is this project and is it really helping folks access either current concentrations of jobs and services or future projected concentrations of those things. Yeah, and then on clean air, you had questions on clean air, right?
Yeah, I mean, just what some of the specific facilities differences might be.
Yeah, so project number 3, I think, was creating, like doing a lot to mitigate, or sorry, let me pull this up here. I can give you a better answer in just a second.
You don't want to give us so much information that we know what project it is, though.
Yeah. Basically, project number 3 was, making really big improvements to reduce emissions, and I think was also doing so in an area where emissions are currently high, and so you get some like bonus points for doing that. Whereas again, like project number 1 was increasing emissions in a place with already high emissions, so they got dinged for that. There are also points being scored here for like improving access to open space, for, let's see, we're almost there. Give you for improving access to open space, for projects that are taking efforts to improve water quality by like reducing runoff and those sorts of things. If a project is in an area that's potentially vulnerable, like a sensitive natural area, if they're taking specific steps to mitigate any harms to that, you can get an extra point for that. So there's lots of sort of, environmentally related points that add up pretty quickly. And so that's where a lot of those points were coming from.
Okay. Question sort of aligned with what Andy raised about the rail trails. And if there are a lot of variations in terms of the, let's say, traffic control signs or facilities in various even locations on the same trail, and even whether or not the flashing rectangular beacon is automatically triggered, or whether it has to be manually triggered, which is going to get less used and is more likely to be overlooked by the pedestrian or bicyclist. And some of them don't even have any crossing facilities at all on the same trail. Are those factors or those crossings qualitatively factored in terms of the overall safety for that particular project or trail, in terms of whether there are or aren't, or the types of crossing facilities and striping, paint, signage?
Yeah, so it's sort of a mix of like quantitative and qualitative evaluation here. I mean, we do say like, if you're making traffic calming improvements,
right,
we'll award you some points, but we sort of give people a little bit of flexibility in what that looks like.
Yeah.
If there are variations on a project length, let's say like one crossing that is busier that has like really robust improvements, and another crossing that is a smaller side street that doesn't. I don't think a project would necessarily get dinged for not having, huge safety improvements on like a crossing at like a neighborhood street or something where you wouldn't expect to need huge traffic calming investments. And so, so the goal here is to sort of give folks examples of, what traffic calming could look like, but to be a little bit less prescriptive of like, you need these exact sort of investments in order to score points here. So we leave it a little bit up to the project proponent to say like, what improvements are you making to signals or to, striping or, roadway geometry to, slow cars, whatever, like, sort of allow the project proponent to tell us what they're doing. And then we'll say like, okay, we'll, sort of evaluate that. But in the methodologies that we're building out, like we want to give a lot of examples for the types of things that would score highly versus ones that would score less high. But we don't want to be overly prescriptive. So we're trying to strike that balance.
It gets a little fine grained, but it is important for the safety because they're getting increasingly high volumes of pedestrian and skateboarders and rollerbladers and strollers and bicyclists and tricyclists. And it would help, I guess, if you did get some ranges or prescription of the type of traffic that goes through there, or the volumes of traffic on those specific roads, for instance, that they can kind of use and take those measurements. Because I've noticed, again, that there are some at certain times of the day, and given the sight lines going into them, you're getting a lot of traffic, but also a lot of users. So particularly on the weekends. So it's just some things in the trails are meant to be, let's say, a magnet for getting people off of riding on some of the roads for the less confident bicyclists or pedestrians. So anyway, nice work and thank you.
Thanks, John. And so we'll take the last question from Franny, and then I have one comment that's going to bring David Montgomery into the conversation. So Franny?
Hi. It's sort of like more of a comment or request, like on the tables like this one. I find it really helpful when you described like what made the big differences, because I sort of see it as one big swarm of scores. And so I was realizing that I would love to see like the current score and the new score in the same scale. That might be helpful to just put them both in percentages. Mm-hmm. But more, I look at it and I say, okay, so project 1 went down, project 2 they all went down. And what I found most helpful is when you sort of said, this one had such and such that made it go up or something. I don't know if there's a way to get that piece of information onto here, like maybe a subtitle or something. Anyway, but it was just really a comment about that I would enjoy seeing it, that I liked hearing those things and that I would enjoy seeing that. So anyway, that's all. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you.
Always.
So are you going to respond, Matt? Or not?
Yeah, I mean, I guess I do think it's a really a good idea to sort of have, the clear, like, this change to this for this reason. I guess the only thing I would say is that, at the end of the day, like, all of these things change for lots of reasons. I mean, there are, across these 3 projects, probably like, over 100 data points that we'd be sort of outlining, like, this change to this change to that, so it is like inherently like super fine grained, which is why, like, going through this, I didn't sort of outline everything. I appreciate that the other explanations were helpful, and, I'm always happy to answer further questions on that. But yeah.
I guess I don't know when I just look at it and I see, okay, the total scores, still this one's the lowest and this one's middle and this one's highest. How did it ultimately affect the total outcome of what projects were? Well, I guess these projects haven't been, this is just a hypothetical scoring of projects that were previously approved, right?
Yeah, so all 3 of these projects, as with all the test scoring projects, so these are all projects that have been funded by the MPO, and that's not going to change. And so this is really just sort of to test out, like, like ballpark our new criteria and say, like, are we getting results that feel good, like, that are sort of capturing what we think we want to capture with all the new changes, but that don't wind us up in a place where, everything is radically altered in terms of how projects compare to each other and those sorts of things. Just because, we know that there's obviously a lot of good in our starting point, and we want to retain, sort of the relative magnitude of those good things, while making sort of more minor tweaks to reflect like the changes that we wanted to make. Yeah, and so, so we won't be going back in any formal way and like rescoring projects that are already funded.
Oh, no, I knew
to
that.
make decisions on it.
I guess I just wanted to be able to say in a sentence when I'm looking at this, like how it changed it, but I didn't know which part to look at, the total or the this or that, except that you did sort of point out those. Okay, thank you.
And I understand what you're getting at, Franny, and certainly this was mainly just to show us, as Matt said, how it compares to the previous system. When it comes to us comparing projects against each other, I think Matt has shown us the more detailed spreadsheet that they use for breaking down each of these categories more finely, and in that you can get some insight as to how the projects are really comparing to each other. And I think when we get those scores, for the next cycle of TIP, if we have questions, specific questions, we can then ask, and they can give us even more detail on what's contributing to a certain factor within safety. So that's that. And so I'm going to make one more comment. Ask a David Montgomery, and I see Andy has his hand up. We'll go back to Andy, and then we'll zip on to the rest of the agenda. So the last thing you brought up, Matt, was that you are going to bring back the TIP High 2 guide. And I remember when I was reading through the material, when we were first starting this process of revision, I saw that guide and we talked about it. And so I'm glad it's coming back. And I know that David Montgomery had asked early on last year, at least, I don't know if I was chair at that time or not, but he'd said, is there some way, some guide for helping people go through the TIP process? And at the time I wasn't aware of one, but it was a good idea. And so you're in the early stages of working on that. So my ask to David Montgomery is that he be the RTAC point person for that, to work with you maybe on that, and to report back to the advisory council, and maybe determine when maybe you should come and talk with us about it. I know you'll be talking to the MPO, but we can maybe have a conversation before the MPO or whatever. So David, would you be interested in doing that?
Sure. I'd also sort of feel compelled to share openly with everyone that Needham right now is going through a process of reevaluating its own thoughts about how to approach the MPO for its TIP process. So there's more than one reason why that would be useful for me to take that role on, but I just want everybody to know that I'll be wearing at least two hats if I do it.
Oh, it's fine. It's great when you have an agenda that drives you to want to do something. So that's great, excellent. So thank you very much. And so we'll circle back to Andy and then zip through the rest of the agenda. Andy?
Sorry, I had some trouble there, so I missed a part, and I'm hoping I'm not repeating anybody else's question. I was actually just thinking, I think, Matt, you said that the equity score, I think it's a larger part of this scoring. I'm wondering if, I know how the equity score has been set up, if there's any possible way for anybody to actually get the full points for the equity score, and beyond it just being a theoretical possibility, but an actual possibility with the scoring process, realizing that you also have to kind of rescale different projects based on kind of which categories they're hitting to. But I'm just wondering, just out of a sense of curiosity, it's a great setup, but I'm actually wondering if it's actually possible to get that point, full 20 points.
That's Mr. Perfect asking you this question. So go ahead, have at it, Matt.
Yeah, no, it is a good question. And, again, one of our sort of overarching questions or themes that we wanted to come to with the whole process is like, can we get projects closer to, like really good projects closer to, a full slate of points. So yeah, on the equity score, for folks, like basically, what we're looking at is not only who lives near a given project, but also what is the project doing that we anticipate will benefit those folks. And so it looks at both things like, is this project improving sidewalks or, improving transit? And is it doing so in an area with, high concentrations of, people of color, people with disabilities, et cetera. And so to score full points, you would have to basically be getting full points on all of the improvements. So like be really, making a lot of robust improvements to, everything from sidewalks to transit to air quality to safety, and then would also have to have like pretty high concentrations of sort of all of the equity populations within the project area. So it would be tough to get a full 20 out of 20, but you can see here, project number 2 did get 16.3 out of 20, which is pretty high. And, I think it would be tough to get a full 20, but, I think up to probably in the 17s, it would be feasible for a project that's really robust and, in an area with lots of folks like protected populations. So yeah, so tough to get perfect, but folks should be able to get fairly close. And then, the same sort of theme goes for all of these, that it's gonna be tough to get full points across the whole board, just because we don't expect every project or any project to do everything. But yeah, but high scoring projects will score relatively higher in the new system, which is good.
Great. Well, thanks, Matt. And so hate to just thank you and run. We got to run.
Yeah,
So,
no worries.
as always, we appreciate it. And I'm sure you'll be back sooner rather than later. All right.
Yeah.
Take care.
Thanks,
Stay
Len.
safe. Welcome.
Yeah, and just for folks, if you have further questions, please don't hesitate to reach out. I'm happy to talk through this with anyone. So.
All right. Now back to the other Matt, Mr. Archer. What's next?
Yes, indeed. So let me just take the controls back from Matt. Sorry about that. And then just get us up to the agenda. But what is coming up is the advisory council election. So here, just give me 1 second. I'm going to turn my camera on for this. I apologize in advance for the not shavedness of myself. Okay, so hey everyone. So I'm here today to, okay, I started that incorrectly. We're here for the RTAC election, the election for the officer positions of chair and vice chair. So I just wanted to give a little bit of background info about that. So the election committee met in September prior to the September meeting. I would like to thank David, Franny, and Anna Christina for participating in that. And during this meeting, the ballot of Len and Scott was agreed upon. And at the September meeting, this was announced as the ballot, and RTAC members were given the opportunity, if they so chose to then at that meeting throw their hat into the ring to run. No one elected to do so. Also, the election committee discussed how to conduct this vote in the virtual environment. Obviously, this is something that's rather new to us, and essentially it was agreed upon that I would look into best practices for voting anonymously with ballots in this case, and I would look into how MAPC was conducting their vote for the MPO election, which I did, and this is how we ended up with the virtual ballots that were sent to all voting members. The rules, for lack of a better term, was that I would download the ballots without opening them, keeping them anonymous, keeping them all with the same file name. And then Kate White very kindly agreed to tally the votes, so I, kept my hands clean of that. And of course, this is an uncontested election, so nothing shocking should be happening there. I will say that almost got a large number of ballots back, not everybody. I do apologize if you did not have time to get the ballot back, or had issues and couldn't send it back. But what I will say is that we do have enough votes to meet quorum. So, and because it's an uncontested election, things should be straightforward here. So before I hand it over to Kate White to announce the results, I just wanted to ask Len and Scott if either of you wanted to say a few things before we announce the verdict. Verdict's not the right word. And if you don't, that's fine.
The results, well, I mean, I'll be quick about it and just say that I have enjoyed this even more than I thought I would. I mean, as you know, I really wanted to do this because I thought it would be a really good learning experience, and that I felt that I could. No one's gonna do better than Tegan, and so that wasn't the goal, but that I could continue continue her path, and give the advisory council as big a voice as it had at the MPO table. I think I've done that, but I have to say that I have just really enjoyed this, and working with you all has been a real joy. You're all a really good bunch of people who really care about regional transportation, and because of that, I find myself wanting to do it more. And also I feel that I feel like I'm getting up to speed. And as I said in my statement, there was a lot of the things that I set out to do last year that I still feel that I need to work on. I mean, those weren't just a list to impress people. They really were a list of things that I wanted to accomplish. And there's a lot there still. And so I welcome the opportunity to continue working on it. So thanks. That's it.
That's great. Scott, do you want to say anything?
Sure. Yeah, I guess echo Len's sentiments that I think you're a great group to work with, and I've also had a lot of fun having some increased responsibility working with RTAC, not just as a member that comes, but as somebody that helps decide the agenda. I think we've had some really good speakers, and we've all learned a lot. And on top of that, I think that we've moved our agenda along as far as trying to get involved earlier in some of the MPO activities, and just kind of increase the weight or influence that RTAC can have where appropriate, at least. And I look forward to continuing to work with Len and all of you in the coming year, just to continue along that path. So thanks.
All right, that's great. Thank you, Scott. So with that, unless anyone has any questions, I should open the floor to questions. I would like to hand it over to my colleague, Kate White, to announce the results. And Kate, I would like to thank you again for taking this on. I very much appreciate it.
Hi, everyone. No problem at all. So we tallied all the votes, and there was a total of 14 votes for Len and 14 votes for Scott. We just wanted to make a special note too that we did receive one ballot that was blank, so that was not counted in the vote since we weren't sure. But yeah, again, Len with 14 and Scott with 14.
All right, that's great. So congratulations, guys. I give you a round of applause. Very excited to have you on for another year. And I think with that, Len, I can hand it back over to you.
Sure, thank you. And thanks, folks. We really appreciate it. And thanks again to all of the assistance and guidance from everyone at CTPS. And so next is I'll do the chair's report, but I don't want to forget the minutes. And so let's skip ahead. And I think I saw the October minutes, Matt.
Correct. Yes.
Yeah.
I apologize. I know at the last meeting we had said that Barbara was going to be helping me out with the meeting minutes. She has had her time prioritized with other things, so I'm still doing them on my own. November is almost done. I'll definitely have December ready as well for the next meeting. But I was perhaps being a bit ambitious when putting together this agenda.
Okay, just be honest. When after a couple of them, she just went, I can't handle these RTAC meetings anymore.
No.
It drives me crazy.
I mean, I actually think it's just personal animosity toward me. I think it's more that than anything else.
All right. All right. Well, thanks for the October minutes. So can we get a motion to approve them? Actually, I need to bring up my participants window. Unless you have a grid view, Matt, and you can see hands up.
No, there are no hands. Folks, if you wouldn't mind using the raise hand function, I do see
Yes.
David.
Yeah. So, David, you're unmiked. I mean, you're unmuted.
I make the motion or second, whichever you need at this point.
We need a motion. So you're making the motion. Okay,
Yep.
great. And see John McQueen's hand up.
A second.
Second. And so how do you want to do the vote, Matt?
Well, first we should ask, does anybody have any changes they would like to make to the minutes?
Thank you, Matt.
Yep.
Anyone have any changes you want to make?
Seeing none. So Len, I'd say that for this, we can just ask, is anybody, and John and David, I'm just going to lower your hands for this in case you do want to raise your hand for this next thing. I think you could say, without objection, we will approve these, essentially. So if anybody is opposed.
As long as it's legit to you, I mean, you're the record bearer. So
that's all right.
All right, if you're opposed, if anyone objects to approving the minutes, raise your hands. All right, and I think we're all set. And of course, if you go through and you see something amiss later on and you need to correct it, we can back up to this and correct. So so that's that. So the chair's report. I guess we've had 2 meetings since our last meeting. And in those meetings, the big things that we've covered have been the major infrastructure definition and how we're going to handle it in the LRTP. And so we did decide that we were going to raise the cost threshold by which we define a major infrastructure project. So in the recent past, which triggered this discussion, was that we had some complete street projects that went above $20 million, and that forced them to be categorized as major infrastructure projects. And so that threw off the weighting to me with respect to our goals as the MPO. And so now that's been raised from 20 million to 50 million. Same time, at the last meeting, we had an interesting session and a set of votes, and one of the votes was that in order to have something put into the LRTP, should it have a cost threshold, and so the vote for that was that we would not have a cost threshold. So it's no longer that if a project is proposed and it costs, let's say, $60 million, that it automatically goes into the LRTP, meaning there are other criteria that determine whether a project is going to go into the LRTP. For instance, whether it changes roadway capacity or whether it has a big effect on air pollution. So those are the factors now that determine whether something goes into the LRTP. And it's not simply going to be a matter of if the project costs $50 million, meaning that it goes into the LRTP, and everything will be measured against the criteria that we have revised. And so when it comes to determine what's going to go into that 5th year of the TIP, we will be presented with the TIP scores, for everything in the LRTP that's ready, or other projects that come before the MPO from other means. Maybe Needham, will have submitted a project that costs $20 million, and it will be ready for evaluation ready for TIP evaluation, and then depending on those scores and how we feel about those scores as the MPO will determine whether or not it goes into the 5th year of the TIP, in which case it's now programmed. So that's it on major infrastructure. Another big thing I found of interest was Sandy came to talk to the MPO last time about the first year of the community connections, and there was a report, a memo that he did on it, and I want to encourage you to read it because there were some interesting things in it, I thought, in particular what it takes to really manage a bunch of small projects and how we have had to work with MAPC to help to manage those. And so for me, there was some surprising, unexpected elements about managing these small projects that, well, it's circular to say that I wasn't expecting, but my point is that I was kind of surprised, but not in a negative way, but given that we have supported this project, this component, so vigorously and for a while, I think we need to really pay attention to what's going on there. And so I'm inviting Sandy to come and talk with us in December about that. He'll probably be ready to talk to us about the beginning part of the UPWP. But in the meantime, as I said, please try to read the memo. And if you want to feed back to me about that before then, that's fine. And as always, anyone on the staff is open to any member's questions at any time, so you don't have to go through me, to talk to anyone on the staff. But if you do and you get some interesting insights, I'm always interested. So that's that on the chair's report. I'll just say for the November meeting, we're going to have Mike Bolduc from MassDOT come to talk with us about how MassDOT evaluates the cost of projects. This was something that popped out of our discussions, our 3C discussions for the TIP. We just want to get a sense of how costs are evaluated so that we have a sense of why it is that costs may go up. Are they being cost? What are the factors that go into determining the cost of it, and is it such that these projects their costs can be evaluated in a way that we're not surprised later on? And this is going to set the stage for me for discussions later on about cost benefit analysis. And we may indeed have Mike back to talk with us about that, because I get the sense he has some very strong opinions about it. Sorry folks, the background's about to start, so I'll wrap this up pretty fast and say that's for November. We'll have Sandy for December, and I think that's it for me in terms of the chair's report. So next on the agenda, Matt. Oh, old business, no business.
Good news.
Anyone have anything?
Need to let David.
We have Andy.
Hey, David.
Let's see. So I just want to make a plug as one of the member cities. Cambridge is one of the member cities of NACTO, the National Association of City Transportation Officials. This year, actually, the Boston region was supposed to be the host of the Designing Cities Conference. But of course, COVID has thrown a wrench into all those plans. And NACTO has actually just released some information about their virtual conference, which will be happening in December, the first 2 weeks of December. There's actually a couple ways folks can participate, but I just wanted to make a plug that you could either be a viewer and watch a few of the selected number of workshops, plenaries, and different sessions, which will be recorded and shared for anybody to view. But also, if you haven't already considered it, to take a look at participating as an actual participant. There's some interactive things that they're proposing that I think is very unique, that you can really only do as a virtual conference. And they're trying to recreate a lot of the conference aspects as well too, using these different formats. But it's a conference that I definitely was looking forward to when it was going to be in its in-person format, and I'm actually really amazed to see how they've been able to transition into a virtual format, and looks to be something that if you're looking for like AICP credits or other things like that, might be a good thing to consider for the end of this year.
Great, thanks, Andy. And now we have AC for Goso.
No, I'm sorry. I saw the link Matt put in the chat, so I wanted a link to Andy's announcement there, his plug. Thank you. Sorry.
Okay. Oh, no problem at all. And one other thing I will mention too is that we when we were going through when we had our August meeting, our meet and greet meeting, there was a member from, I think it was Brookline, Dan Martin, who wanted us to explore more about the intermodal, the Austin intermodal project, and we were trying to get someone from MassDOT to talk with about that. We worked it, and we weren't able to make it happen for this month or next month at this point. But there's an open invitation there, so we'll see what happens. But I just wanted to point out that there is a opportunity to more input by the end of the month, and so a notice went out about that. I think there's going to be a meeting actually on the 20th, next this coming Tuesday, 6:30 to 8:30. So for folks who are interested in that, you might want to check that out. So that's about it. We'll entertain, unless someone has something else, maybe we'll entertain a motion to adjourn.
So move.
Thank you, Franny. Second?
I'll second.
Excellent, AC. And unless there are objections, the meeting's over and you get 10 minutes back. And so thanks, folks. Really enjoyed this.
Thank you.
And looking forward to another year.
Thank
care.
you
Very much.
You're welcome.
Congratulations, Scott and
Oh.
Lynn.
Thanks. Bye-bye.